This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 473, Color in CSS with Sass. On today's show, we are talking about color with CSS, Sass, and bringing it all into Drupal with our guest, Aubrey Sambor. We'll also cover navigation, extra tools as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is Aubrey Sambor. Aubrey is a lead engineer at Lullabot and specializes in CSS accessibility with over 15 years of Drupal experience. She loves knitting, coffee, fountain pens, and a good IPA. Aubrey, welcome back to the show, and thank you for joining us for the last 4 weeks.
Yeah, this has been fun. Thanks for having me.
I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are John Bacozzi, solution architect at EPAM.
Hello, everyone.
And now to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules and recipes of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. Have you been using the new navigation module in Drupal core, but wanted some of the useful links previously available in the admin toolbar tools submodule? There's a module for that. It's called Navigation Extra Tools, and it was created in October of 2024, really less than a week ago, by a friend of the podcast, James Shields, aka Lost Car Park. It has a 1.0.0 beta 3 version available, which works with Drupal 10.3 and 11. It is actively maintained. In fact, it already has 3 beta releases. It does not have security coverage because it's really too new to even opt into that. It does have test coverage, and in terms of open issues, technically there are 8 open issues, but 4 of those are bugs, and all but one of them are actually already marked as fixed with the latest release. According to Drupal.org, it's already in use by 12 sites. And with this module enabled, the new left side navigation menu that is in Drupal core will include links to clear the caches, so either all caches at once or a specific cache. You can also run cron or run database updates. Now, it's a good example of a module that does something very specific and very useful, so I wanted to share it with our listeners as quickly as possible. I know these functions are ones I've been missing in my own Drupal 11 dev site, so I'm looking forward to using this module right away.
Yeah, I just want to make one comment. 2 comments. One is James has already fixed that 4th bug. So he's been very active in the issue queue at the moment.
Right on.
I mean, this is exactly the reason why I'm not using the new navigation module in core. I mean, those tools, that's it. I mean, now I can use it.
Well, that's silly. So I have a different feeling about this, and maybe it's just because I don't clear, like when I clear caches, I just clear all the caches. I don't clear my caches selectively, which some may send me messages about, like, how dare you? But I've actually been using the new navigation menu module in Drupal, right? And it is great. I freaking love it because of the drop downs and the slide in, slide out, the ease of use, right? I would say that I've actually found I've rekindled a use for shortcuts, because that's typically where I put like the quick links to things that I need, like if I need to do a embed or a import of config or a cache clear or look at my purge cache settings, that sort of thing, like it goes into the shortcuts. So I can see the use of this module for like the kind of breaking down the caches, because like that is clearly not part of core currently. But are there other options in the toolbar that are or that this adds that are useful that I'm not aware of?
I mean, for me, the 2 big ones are running cron, because I mean, yeah, it's accessible under status report, but you have to wait for that page load. And for clearing cache, like I almost never clear individual caches either, but why do I have to wait for the performance page to load? Like whatever page I'm on, it's just one click to clear the cache and you're done. I mean, especially if you're on like production or something, like if it's local, I have my terminal, I can just use Drush. But if it's production and I'm not logged in to the server, it's handy to just have a one-click thing rather than having to go and if it's shortcuts, well, then you have to manage access, right? You don't want to give clients access to clear cache necessarily unless they're developers. So yeah, having this tool, having the access controls there, just super handy.
Yeah, and what I was going to say is one of the things that I find really handy about having the clear cache in the toolbar is that it's one click that clears the cache and brings you back to where you are. Whereas with a shortcut, it's going to, like, you could do something like open that in a new tab and then clear the cache and then go back to where you were manually. But it's like more steps than just having that one nice link that sort of brings you right back to exactly what you were doing.
Yep.
And it ends up being 3 page loads because you have to load the performance page, wait for the cache to clear, go back to the original page, and reload to see it, even if you open it in a tab.
Nick's developing websites on a word processor. It sounds like he's worried about the page loads there. I will say though, staying on the same page that you're on is a nice feature.
I mean, why add 30 seconds to every cache clear, or even 5 seconds? Why add 5 seconds? I clear my cache on my sites like 300 times a day. That add an extra hour to my life every day, just waiting for page loads. But yeah, I don't know. I have tinkered with the navigation toolbar. I did like the experience quite a bit more. But I mean, literally the reason why I didn't use it was because it didn't have these tools. It's a little sad on the other hand, because admin toolbar has been such a go-to rock solid module for years and years and years. And I mean, once this is in, it feels like that's going to go away. Um, but it's also nice to move forward too. I'll have to check this out.
I personally agree with that statement and don't agree with that statement at the same time, because now I don't have to go and install a separate module on every site. I can just enable it because it's already there. So
Yeah, no,
I mean,
yeah, exactly. But it's so bittersweet. I mean, can you imagine maintaining a module like that for so long? And then, I mean, it's also probably nice to not have to maintain a module that has so many installs, because I imagine the amount of reports that they get that are just completely bogus uh, is pretty high. But, you know,
Yeah, I mean, for reference, admin toolbar module has, according to Drupal.org, over 300,000 installs, which has got to be, top 10 in terms of overall usage. So yeah, I can only imagine the level of pressure they feel when they're doing like a major release or anything like that.
I had a similar realization or instance with XML sitemap the other day. I was installing an XML sitemap, and I went and I used the XML sitemap module, and then I was looking at it and I was kind of like, oh, this doesn't 100% do everything I needed to do. And then simple XML sitemap or simple sitemap came up, and I was like, what do I do? Who's using what? The
that
Talking Drupal channel was very helpful in guiding me in the right direction.
I actually just left a comment on that because I've been trying to work with XML sitemap to get them Drupal 11 ready. And then somebody mentioned like, oh, maybe you want to maintain it. And I was considering it, but then I realized I don't use XML sitemap. I use simple sitemap, but I inherited a site and that site was using XML sitemap. And so ultimately what I'm going to do is just change to the one that I'm more familiar with that already has Drupal 11 support. But it's funny that like they're so closely named, I didn't even realize myself. I think what happened was XML sitemap used to be the go-to in Drupal 7. It took a long time to make the jump to Drupal 8, like a really long time. And simple sitemap was created as a Drupal 8 sitemap module because people needed it, and people just haven't. And then XML sitemap updated, and people haven't fully moved over. But now that simple sitemap is in Drupal CMS, I imagine that'll get more attention anyway. But go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that is going to be one of the benefits ultimately of Drupal CMS is the ability to sort of identify maybe best of breed solutions for things and have the community kind of coalesce on some of those.
Or revolt, depending on how things go. But we'll see. I will say, Martin, that you have convinced me, as well as you, Nick, that I should install navigation extra tools. So I will do that on my train ride tonight.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Martin. And if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you and suggest a module of the week like the one today, what's the best way for them to do that?
We are always happy to get nominations for Module of the Week in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack, like today's module. And folks can also reach out to me directly as ManClue on all of the Drupal and social platforms.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Now, here is Bernardo and Lee to tell you about Open Source Camp in Chattanooga.
Hey everyone.
Join us for the Open Source Camp, which includes Drupal Camp Chattanooga, happening in person November the 2nd at Chattanooga State Community College. Besides sessions on open source technologies, this year we will also have 2-day-long introductory trainings for WordPress and Drupal, WordPress in a day and Drupal in a day, an opportunity to learn what these technologies provide out of the box and which one might suit your needs best.
Attendees and speakers have worked for your local government, federal, and higher ed institutions. Register at opensource.camp. Limited spots available. See you then.
Thanks, guys. And on to our primary topic. All right, Aubrey. So this is our 4th episode together, and this is a topic that you've chosen. Can you give us a little bit of background in your career and kind of what brought you to the front end?
Yeah, sure. So I've been doing software development professionally for 18 years, I think since 2006. And I've been doing just front end stuff in general back since the late 90s. So I've been doing this for a while. I started off just doing random like PHP development, things like that, and some CSS on the side. I did a little bit of design. um yeah, I've done like all the things, and then I finally got into Drupal in 2009, and haven't looked back since, and that's been a lot of fun. I've been kind of back and forth with Drupal throughout my career. I've done JavaScript development. I was a Java developer for a bit. I worked as a designer for a
Really?
bit, like not writing code at all. So I've done so much stuff in my career, but the front end has always been my favorite part. And Drupal in general, I really got into Drupal because there was a role within Drupal where I could just write a lot of front-endy things, like some JavaScript, some PHP, some CSS, some kind of presentational PHP. And so I really liked it, and I really liked Drupal, and that's where I've been now for like the last 6 or 7 years in particular. I've been focusing more on the front end, so it's been really nice.
So why why gravitate towards front end development? I mean, I think like or maybe more specifically towards like CSS and color, because like I mean like there's a wide range of development out there.
Yep. Yep. So color has just been really interesting in particular because I was into like design and stuff at first. And like just being able to make designs and make them come to life has been really fun. And that was something that really interested me about color. In particular, more recently, I've wanted to learn more about color and the new color options in CSS because there's a lot going on in CSS. Like the CSS world has become, there's been so much advances in CSS and there's been so much advances with color recently that I really wanted to learn more about some of the color options I never explored before. So that's what I wrote this. I wrote a talk about it that I have been giving this year and that I'll be giving at New England Drupal Camp next month. And it's cool to just learn about new, just like new things that are coming out and new ways to experience color, especially with newer monitors, newer devices that support wider color ranges. That's been really, really nice.
Yeah, I have to say that's one thing I feel like I've noticed, and maybe it's just the projects I've been working on or something else, but I feel like CSS is moving faster now than it ever has. Like the first half of my career, because I've been doing web stuff now for 15 years or so as well. I remember the first forever was just like you would learn these ways to do things and you would have to handle IE 8 or 11 or whatever. And it just kind of stayed static forever. And I mean, I know it's been around for a while now, but like it feels like things like Flex and variable fonts and grid and like all these tools that just make handling like it feels like CSS used to be like more try to make the web like print and style certain things. And now it's like, well, the web
Mhm.
is the web. Let's provide web native tools. And CSS feels like it feels like CSS is supporting that stuff um,
Yeah.
quicker
Yeah,
now
it's
than it
doing
used to.
yeah, I feel like there's been a lot of advances really within the last 10 years or so with Flexbox and Grid and just any of the other, like, I'm trying to think of other things, like custom properties, the CSS variables,
Oh yeah.
that's fairly new. I guess fairly new. That's been around for maybe about 8 to 10 years now too, but that was a huge advance. Just all these things that are now all of a sudden coming out has been it's been great. It's been great actually, like, seeing some changes because I do feel like you said, for a long time, CSS was so static and you're just doing the same things you had been doing for the last 10, 15 years, and then all of a sudden, now you've gotta learn how to do Flexbox. Now you've gotta learn how to use Grid because float, back in the day, you would have to float all of you use the floats to do, like, layouts and things like that. And that was just kind of brittle and broken and not really why floats were made. But now there is Flexbox and Grid that are these are to make layouts on your pages. And responsive web design is also a big one to talk
Yeah.
about because that wasn't around back when I was first starting either, and that has been a game changer as well. But yeah.
What's the like
Yeah.
time frame we're talking about here? Because like I feel like back when I did CSS, like, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, it was like CSS, you had cascading style sheets. Yay. And
Hmm.
then like towards the end of my CSS, you had, Sass came in and then you had that other one that kind of went away.
Less
Less, right.
Oh yeah.
And
stylus. There's
Less.
a couple of
yeah,
those.
Less
There's a
is still
so
couple.
like
around.
so like
Yeah, there's
you had preprocessors and now we're like, and throughout those you always had like ways of handling color, right? But
mhm.
now it feels like you have maybe more advanced ways of handling color. So I'm just wondering, like, what kind of time frame are we talking about? Are we talking about like the last 5 years? Are we talking about the last 10 years?
Are we talking about color in particular or just some CSS advances in general?
Let's be more general, like the
Okay.
just the advancement in CSS or the rapid advancement that you've seen. Is it like the last 2 years? Like, I'm just wondering.
Rapid advance, I would say it's probably been the last maybe 6 or 7 years. I
Okay.
just looked
Yeah.
up when Flexbox was supported in all browsers except for IE, and that was in 2014. So Flexbox has been around for a while, and obviously, IE has kind of supported Flexbox. Like IE 11, there's some issues with it. It has partial support. But so I think that was Flexbox going in was kind of the start of the modern CSS era. So
Yeah.
that was 10 years ago. But Grid came out. So I'm just looking this up on Can I Use just so we can see when this came out. Grid was more, oh, it looks like it was 2015, 2016, 2017. So that one was a couple years later. So I want to say maybe 2017 and later is kind of more of the modern age of CSS with Grid and Flexbox being more supported in all browsers by
Yeah.
2017. And then custom properties came in and really changed the game. I feel like with being able to use those too.
I feel like
Hmm.
there's another piece to it though, because it wasn't just CSS providing it, it's all the browsers supporting it. And that's the piece that I feel like has really accelerated. Like even Flexbox, when it first came out, you couldn't use it because
Yeah.
nobody really supported it or just Chrome did. And and now when there's a new feature, it comes out pretty quickly. Another interesting thing that I just noticed, by the way, I don't know if you've seen this, Aubrey, but MDN, so developer.mozilla.org, now kind of does the "Can I use" piece now.
Yeah, the
So if you
baseline,
scroll
I
at the
was gonna
bottom
bring that up. Yeah.
yeah, and if you're on a browser that doesn't like, we were trying to figure out why text wrap pretty doesn't work, and if
Mhm.
you're on a browser that doesn't support a particular property, it'll put a big red X on the property for you, so you can see that it doesn't work for your browser, which is
Oh,
pretty nice.
oh, that's interesting. I haven't done that in, different browsers. That's good to
I'm
see because
I'm going to show my complete lack of CSS fluency in something that you said about 5 minutes ago. So floating things not good. Flexbox is good. Yes.
yes.
Okay.
But
And
there's
like,
also
Grid is
grid. Grid is depending on what you're doing because there's still a good use case for Flexbox and grid. But yeah, floats you don't want to use anymore because floating is it was kind of a stopgap for not having a better way to lay things out on your page.
sure.
Like floats are more intended for if you have an image within some content, you want to float the image and have the content wrap around it.
Yep.
That's kind of more what floats intent is. But then see, Flexbox came out first, and you kind of I use Flexbox a lot for if I have a row of things and I need to align things, especially in a header. You would see this a lot in like a site header where you'd have the logo on the left and maybe you have some login links on the right. And the way to align those so that they're all in the same line, and that they kind of look more presentable without having to use floats is kind of what Flexbox was made for. And then
Got it.
grid is a more of a two-dimensional where you can align things
yeah.
on a column and a row. So that's good for if you have a sidebar or content on the like content on one side and
More
like being able to,
specific, like,
yeah.
hey, I need this to be on this point on the page. Got it.
Yeah.
Yep.
And what one of the funny things too for because I'm not a front end developer, like I can get by, right? But whenever I'm working with a team or a new client, one of the things they say is like you don't want me writing your front end. It's gonna be less performant, won't look as good, and it'll be slower. But like in a stopgap, I can write front end stuff. But I feel like a lot of times my troubleshooting for CSS is like, is it flexed? If it's not, let me try putting display flex. And
Hmm.
I feel like half the time that fixes whatever issue I was having. And then the next step for me usually depending if it's like vertical, it's always like, okay, align items. Wait, is it align items or align content? Because I can never remember which is which.
Or justify content. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Align
always
items
try all
versus
three of those and
justify.
trying to figure
Yep.
out which one's which. But yeah,
You can use
flex
those
is
in grid
magic.
too. Yep.
I'm
Yep.
just realizing that now, no, the comment I made before about doing CSS wonky stuff on my personal website, nobody should go look at my personal website CSS now because people are
Oh,
going to be
that's what I'm
like,
doing after.
he's like, wait,
Yeah.
why? He's still using align text. Like, what the heck is this guy doing?
Just don't do a line
Um,
center in your HTML, then you're fine. No.
Oh no, I would never do that. No, they you always keep them separate.
Or the font
so
tag. Don't use that anymore either.
oh yeah, good. Um, so front end can mean a couple of different things. Generally, it means JavaScript or CSS. Do you lean one way or the other, or do you kind of enjoy both JavaScript
Yeah,
coding and,
it's
and
it's
CSS?
it's so interesting being around in the tech community for so long, where I feel like front end meant something differently maybe 15 years ago than it does now. Like with front end and back end, front end was kind of more all encompassing CSS, JavaScript, all the things that aren't like writing PHP or Java or things like that. I do hear front end a lot more in terms of purely JavaScript. So I find that very interesting that there's more of like front end. When people say you're a front end developer, people make the assumption that I'm a JavaScript developer, that I write React or Vue or something like that. I am actually more on the CSS side of things. I do and have written JavaScript framework, like with JavaScript frameworks before, but I'm definitely more on the CSS side of things. I'm definitely more of a um, really interested in how styles work, really interested in using the latest and greatest styles and making sure that I'm not overwriting and over architecting my CSS. So yeah, I'm definitely more of that. But I do write JavaScript. Right now, it's a lot more presentational JavaScript on some of the projects I'm on. I'm not on. I've been on React projects and stuff like that in the past, but definitely more on the CSS and presentational JavaScript sort of things now, which it's an area I like more than writing hardcore back end JavaScript.
Cool. Um, Interested in going back, seeing as we want to talk more about CSS than any of the other front end aspects, right? Going back into colors, right? So like the idea that like colors in CSS have changed quite a bit today than they did in the past. I'm wondering, can you kind of like can you can you give me a speed round or a speed update on how things have changed? So where am I coming from? Like back in the day, back when I used to do it, um, you'd use a hex value. Yeah, you could set like a CSS variable. So like, lullabot red would be this hex value, right? Nowadays, you kind of see that like people are using RGB colors or RGB values, and like then you can build out gradients and you can do all sorts of crazy stuff with your CSS. And I'm wondering like, how has it changed? Like what's your preferred kind of method?
Yeah, so for the longest time, and this might be where I start getting kind of nerdy into the color stuff, so if it's a little too technical, let me know. But for most of the internet, most of time up until maybe I want to say maybe 5 to 7 years ago. I'm going to be completely wrong on the years here, but a lot of what kind of colors you can use on the web had to do with the devices you're viewing the web on. Most devices up until again 5 or it might be longer than 7 years ago, I'd have to look up the exact dates, but most devices only supported RGB. You think of like your old CRT monitors and really, really old projectors and things like that.
Yeah.
So,
I remember
yeah.
like back in the day, right? And this is a long time ago, you had like web safe colors that you were
Yep.
like only the web colors you could use on the internet.
Yep, with the 256 colors that you could use, and that's it. And then later on, there was the introduction of the hex values, where you have a certain range of colors that you can use, and those are all RGB based as well.
Mhm.
Pretty much everything you could use up until recently were all based on RGB values. So any of the other if you're using RGB, HSL, things like that, those are all still based off of using RGB. So, yeah, but up until like what's it called? Wide gamut or like P3 devices came out,
Hmm.
and that is it's a device that will show a much wider range of colors than even RGB.
Hmm.
And so Apple devices, like if you have an iPhone or Mac, your Mac monitor, most external monitors now too also support wide gamut P3 colors, so you'd be able to see a wider range of colors. And since these devices are so new, it hasn't been possible to see the wider range outside of RGB until recently. And
So
so that's a
Okay.
big difference there.
would you say that there's still such a thing as like web safe colors, or is it a wider, yes, there are, but it's a wider spectrum now?
Yeah, I think it's a wider spectrum now, and there are like depending on which other color functions you're using, you can go out of gamut, which is a thing. It's a saying about um, it's a saying about out of gamut. The gamut is the range of colors that are supported on the device, and if it's a function that you're using to make a color, if one of your parameters is off, it could actually go out of the range, so it doesn't even show a real color at all because it doesn't exist.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of weird things you can do now with this wider range where you have to kind of pay a little more attention and kind of know what you're doing with using some of these other P3 functions and P3 color spaces and things like that. So there's a lot
I have
of
a
there's a lot of stuff that's a little more complicated now.
Yeah, so I have a super back-end developer slash colorblind person question,
Yeah.
and then I have an observation. My question is, why? Isn't 16 million colors enough? Like, why do you need more colors? And because again, I assume we're talking outside of like video or something where you're just getting more like realistic colors. But when you're designing, why do you need more colors?
So a lot of the colors that you might see are you might want to have a brighter color is really the big thing.
Okay,
The big thing that you
so
would
it's
want to
you.
use brighter colors for, like you want a brighter pink or a brighter like blue or things like that. There is like a human visual gamut, which is the view of all colors visible by the human eye, and RGB is a little triangle right inside of there, so it doesn't actually cover all the visual range of people who can see different colors.
Yeah.
So That's the other color spaces will kind of like try to get more of that. Like the triangle gets bigger depending on what color spaces you're in. And in those color spaces, when they get bigger, you would see like that it would include like pinks and greens and things like that. This is a hard thing to talk about
Yeah.
without showing.
I'll have a link to a picture of the gamut, and that was my one of my the observation I was gonna give is that I never realized how little green there was in RGB.
Yep.
But if you look at the expansion, and this will be in the show notes, like I said, so feel free to
Mhm.
take a look at that. But now P3 does expand on almost every side except for blue. It gives a little bit
Yep.
more red, a little bit more orange, a little bit more yellow, but really the majority of what's giving you is access to more greens. But now, is there like an initiative to try to get more blues, or is it just that blue really is the color that's most well represented at the moment? Because that, if you're looking at the triangle, that's like the narrow end of the tip, the
Yep.
blues, and that seems like there's a big gap there, or not gap,
Yeah, I know.
missing.
Yeah. Yeah, I know there's like some weirdness with some of the P3 colors and blues and purples, and the way that it traverses through the different colors. Again, it's just hard to talk about without pictures. But so I'm thinking there are some like I know I've seen some GitHub issues that maybe the CSS working group has opened up and tried to kind of update the because it's lots of math to actually get this to do what you want it to do. So it gets really complicated and mathy really fast, where like the way that it travels from one color to the other. So I think that's part of the issue why there's some issues with blue. But I would think there's an initiative to cover the like make a color range a little like make the color range a little more like what's the word I'm looking for? Consistent or have it cover more colors than it actually is right now. But that's just with P3. There's other color spaces. I'm trying to remember what the other one is. Like something Rec 2020, I think is another
Yeah,
one.
Rec 2020 and Pro Photo
Yeah,
RGB.
the Pro Photo. Yeah.
So if kind of circling back, because I think you answered the gamut question. You mentioned that it gets a little mathy, and I know that clamp is another really powerful thing that front end developers like, but sometimes explaining that to designers takes a little bit of time and effort.
Mhm.
What does if you're going to use gamut? Let's say I find a color that's in the P3 space that I want to use on my font or my headings or something. Like, what does that rule look like, or how do I go about generating that? Like, what are some of the gotchas there?
Yeah, so a lot of I know for a little bit Figma wasn't supporting some of these other 3 P3 colors yet, that everything was still RGB, in Figma and things like that, so designers, I'm not sure how much designers are actually using these colors, the P3 colors in their designs, but if you're wanting to do it in your code yourself, there are some new functions you can use. I'm looking to find them right now. There's like a big one. The big one that you've probably heard about that's using these P3 colors is the LCH and LAB color spaces or functions. And that has to do with a lot of, like, accessing a bunch of these different things, and that way you can go ahead and do that, with using those. Another thing you can use is something called the color function, and you can actually pass in which color space you wanna use. You can actually pass in P3, and then you put in, like, 3 values in there to kinda, like, put it on the range to, get the P3 colors you also want. So there's a couple different ways of doing it, but I don't know how much if you're working with a designer, how much you're actually getting those colors from a designer. It's probably more if you're doing things just in the browser without working off of a Figma file and things like that. So I know people use them. I haven't really been using them in my day-to-day work as a front end developer, but I know if I want to play around with them, there's ways to do it. I just haven't done it yet
Okay.
professionally.
I was just my last question whenever there's something new like this is always fallbacks. Do you have to consider fallbacks, or does the color function like automatically map it to something that's web safe for people that don't have a P3 enabled device?
So I think you can use supports, and I think that's the way to fall it back. I never know exactly how it actually falls back if you don't put supports in, and that is a question I get all the time, and I can't find an answer for it. So I just say to use supports to say if you're, supports P3 colors, run this function, or if it supports LCH, you can run the function and things like that. But I think there should be a good way to fall back. I want to say it just falls back to what the first declared color or something like that. Again, don't quote me on this. I need to actually dig around and see if there's an actual answer to this. I haven't been able to find it. And I've gotten this question asked of me when I've given this talk and I still can't find the answer. So I don't know. I think it's still so new that there hasn't really been a lot of thoughts on fallbacks. And I don't know
Yeah.
how much in the wild these are being used yet.
Well, that's the other side too. How do you know if you have a P3 enabled device? Like, I
Yeah.
assume most modern phones are, but my my computer's pretty old. My monitors are pretty old. Do they support it? Like,
Yeah.
is there an easy
Yeah,
test?
that's the thing. Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, I think most monitors, if you've gotten it within the last 10 to 15 years,
Oh, it's not
it
that
should
old.
be.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it would have to be like
Mm.
probably from the aughts or in the 90s for it to not support P3. So anything new. And if you have a Mac that's like before like a Mac that's within the last like 10 to 15 years, I think it should be supported as well. You're probably good.
I'm always interested by the fact that CSS has now become more of a programming language. Once things like Sass and less came onto the scene and you could start doing, functions, and you could start like manipulating, colors and values and stuff like that. Like, I don't know, it became a little bit more than just like CSS, right? That's always interesting to me as anytime I talk with somebody about CSS, is that like, oh, like I have a mixin to do this and I have a function to
Mhm,
do that, and you're like, oh, okay, cool. So like you provide it with this one color value and it builds out your whole like a whole variety of colors based on that can be used within the theme or the output. I'm like, oh, all right,
mhm,
interesting. um so around that, right, around color and color functions specifically, like
mhm,
it sounds to me, and you can kind of like correct me where I'm going astray here, but it sounds to me that like there are two different maybe use cases for color functions, or maybe two different major use cases for color functions, right? It's
mhm,
taking a color and then changing that color, whether it's hue, saturation, contrast, brightness, that sort of thing, right?
mhm,
So that like, hey, we have the main color and then we're going to build all of these derivatives, right? And then it's or I guess maybe there are three aspects here. But then there's the aspect of, creating a function to maybe build something like a gradient, right? Where
mhm.
you could say, here are the two colors, build a gradient for this, right? And
Yep.
then that third case to me feels like kind of like the painter's palette, right? Where you might be taking a couple of different colors and making like a new color with it.
Mhm.
Like out of those use cases, is there anything else that color functions are really helpful with, really useful for?
I think those are the main things they're used for. Like I'm looking at there is a newer color function called color dash mix that allows you within CSS, within native CSS to mix colors, which is something you hadn't been able to do before that. Like you would have to use Sass. Like Sass actually has that kind of function built into it, but native CSS hasn't. So that is a good way to mix. Like if you want to mix a blue and a white to make the blue lighter, sometimes you would use color mix to do that
Mhm.
and things like that. And you can use that in all the different color spaces as well, like RGB, OKLCH. You can specify which color space you're going to use that in, and you can do that. But for the most part, you can do it in either Sass or native CSS. And that's for, yeah, if you just want to do mix the color like that.
It's funny as you were talking and describing that, I just was reminded of a meme that I saw on probably Insta, if I had to guess, but it's of a guy, and like you bring him a swatch of color, and he has like a whole bunch of like cans of paint and different colors, and like he gets you a cup and he like mixes the paint in the thing, and then he like puts it into an aerosol can and like sprays it on a piece of paper and it's an exact match. Like, to me, it feels like functions are like that guy where it's like,
Mhm.
here's my input, like make me the thing, right?
Yeah.
Which is I don't know, feels pretty awesome to me.
Yeah, it's really cool to have all these different kinds of functions, and then there's other functions where you have things like HSL, the hue, saturation, lightness. That's another, RGB-based color function you can use, and you can split it all out, either with Sass variables or with custom properties. You can declare your hue, saturation, and lightness. You can declare each individual property, the hue, the saturation, and the lightness as each its own variable. And then when you're actually calling
Okay.
the HSL function, you would have, the the hue, the saturation, and the lightness, and you can calculate. You can use some calculations on these custom properties to lighten or like change the hue a little bit, or lighten or darken it, or make it more or less saturated. So there's cool little
Oh,
things like that you can do as well, both
sure.
Sass and native CSS.
Yeah, so I feel like that if you're using custom properties in interacting, you can really make like a much more I bet you could make a much more interactive dark mode type of thing like that reacts because one of the things that dark mode or light mode don't really account for is the brightness of the screen or the brightness of the environment. But I
Mhm.
feel like if you have these types of things in a variable properly, you could have some sort of slider that it works with those to allow you to like
Mhm.
really fine tune how visible something is on a screen. Now, I don't want to be the one to program or build that because I have a feeling the amount of variables you'd be dealing with would be astronomical. But that's interesting because I feel like this could really become something powerful for accessibility or even like a colorblind mode, right? I think a lot of
Mhm.
colorblind modes just kind of change colors, but if you can change like hue or saturation or something to more baseline, that will make
Yep.
something more visible for a colorblind person, but without losing a lot of the fidelity, right?
Mhm. Yeah, definitely.
So before we move off of functions, I'm wondering if you have any that are your favorites or ones that you're really excited about or
Yeah, I mentioned one earlier. I mentioned color mix. I really like being able to just mix colors in using native CSS because it's fun being able to do it without having to set up the Sass tooling or and things like that. So I like that one. And then there's another one. I'm gonna try to figure out a way to explain what this is without like sharing my screen or anything. But it's something called relative color syntax. It's another way to kind of change the individual property of some of these color functions. You can use custom properties, like say in HSL, where you set the custom property for the hue, the saturation, and the lightness. But within relative color syntax, you can do those calculations right within the function itself without having to split out all the custom properties for each one. So you would just write HSL, and then in there you would actually have the H, the S, and the L. Those are kind of like the like there's a word for it because it's similar to what you would do in JavaScript with destructuring. It kind of destructures the HSL, so you can manipulate the H, the S, and the
Hmm.
L within the function itself so that you don't have to do all those custom properties to bring them together. So you can do like with the hue, you can do H plus 200, like 200 degrees, because the hue is declared as a function around a number around the color wheel in degrees. Or you can do saturation, S plus 50%, because the saturation is from 0 to 100%. And lightness, if you want to make it darker, you do, L minus like 2% or whatever to make it lighter. So you can do that directly within the function itself as opposed to building out
Huh.
all the custom properties individually. So that's a cool one too for if you're doing a lot more of that. And that has just I think it's in all major browsers now. I'd have to double check, but I'm pretty sure Firefox now supports it, and that was the holdout for relative color syntax. So it's a pretty cool one if you're doing a lot of stuff like that.
I have to keep that in mind. Um, Shifting gears slightly, you've been questioning the long-term viability of SaaS for a little bit of time. at this point. You gave a talk last year called "Do You Still Need Sass in 2023?" Um,
Mhm.
is Sass still a thing? I think we were talking about this a little bit before the show. Is Sass still a thing? What would you use it for? What value does Sass still provide?
Yeah, Sass is still pretty widely available. I think there are a lot more people debating whether or not if they still need to use Sass. I'm still using it on a lot of my projects because the one big thing that Sass has that CSS does not have yet is mixins and functions, by being able to write your own. And that is one thing I use a lot. I use it a lot for, declaring a lot of the typography on my site. Like, I'll have mix-ins for every single, like, heading size. Like, I would have, like, size SX, size S, size M, and it would just be, the font size, the font weight, and I forget what else I put in there, whether or not it has to have an underline. So I still like using mix-ins for things like that. If you're not using a lot of those day to day in your projects, like if you're not wanting to build out custom typography, if you're not using a lot of functions, then you don't need to use Sass. But I'm still using it because there is stuff like that that isn't supported yet in native CSS. I think there are some discussions probably somewhere within the CSS working group to pull some of those in, but they're nowhere near ready for prime time yet, as far as I know. So we've got some
Okay.
time before you can really, really replace all of Sass with native CSS. But you can use a lot of them interchangeably. You can use custom properties and Sass variables. Obviously, if you're using a Sass function, you have to use a Sass variable. You can define a lot of your things using custom properties and assign those to Sass variables so you can use them there. So you can still use both at the same time, but yeah, Sass is still around for a bit.
So follow-up question to that, or also I guess part of my next question is like, does CSS have its own like preprocessor built into it these days? Like, because that was the big kind of like need for Sass, right? Was that like you needed to preprocess all your color creations and all your, all your functions to make sure that like your CSS was like understandable by the
Mhm.
browser, right? Like, so is that still a use case for Sass, or is like does CSS have like a preprocessor built into it that you
Nope.
can use?
Technically, the browser is the preprocessor because everything is just done within the browser. So one advantage to using custom properties over a Sass variable is that obviously a Sass variable is compiled and then you can't change it afterward. You can't change it on the fly because it's a compiled variable.
Right.
With custom properties, you can actually use JavaScript to change the colors and whatever on the fly. Like you can have a slider that's written in JavaScript that changes, like, oh, I want to change this button to be blue instead of pink or stuff like that.
Oh, okay.
And you can actually you don't have to write like a ton of JavaScript to do that. You would just say, change this custom property value to be this. You can actually change the value of the custom property itself within JavaScript.
Yeah.
So
And,
that's
and there,
a huge advantage.
there's kind of three things that are also an advantage that you're kind of glossing over, I think. And that is that when you're changing that variable, it's changing that variable for everything that's using
Yeah.
it,
Yep.
not just changing it for the one instance. Like, you're not changing that style. You're just like, things are saying use this variable, font size, and you're changing that font size. Every single thing using that font size, well, it's scoped, but everything using that font
Yeah.
size within that scope will
Yep.
change. So you don't
Yep.
have to
Yeah.
go and find all the different things using it. The second thing is it pierces the shadow DOM, John's favorite
Yep.
phrase. So
Yep.
it,
Sure does.
it's if you're using web components, then it will affect them as well. And the third one is because it's scoped, you can scope them in such a way that you can also override them underneath if you need to. So
So
it's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
so now in order to write CSS in this method, I have to know JavaScript.
You
No.
don't need to know JavaScript. This is more if you're wanting to have some sort of dynamic functionality on your site. If you're just
Ah,
wanting to set colors and things like that, you don't need to know JavaScript necessarily. This is just if you're wanting some sort of functionality where, oh, I want to change the font size. There's a button I want to click to make the font size bigger. That you would need to use JavaScript to do that kind of thing. But if you're just like, saying, I want this font size to be this size in these particular instances. You just write the CSS for that.
Okay, so I'm gonna try to simplify this for my brain so I can, and maybe for our listeners' brains too, right? So I can set color variables in CSS, right? Like
Yep.
that's native functionality.
hmm
I can build functions in native
Not
CSS.
in native CSS
Not
yet.
native
No.
CSS. Okay. So that's something that I would need a preprocessor for, right?
Yeah, you would
Yeah.
still need Sass. That's one thing that that native CSS is missing is native functions and mix-ins that Sass has. And of course, it's
Got
been
it.
confusing because I've been saying CSS functions during this talk, and that's more the color functions that are built into CSS. It's not you can't make your own functions yet in CSS.
So
This is just
there is a
predefined ones.
set of tools, right? CSS functions that exist. So if you wanted to, lighten a color, darken a color, you
Mhm.
have the ability to do that sort of
Yep.
stuff. You just can't write a custom one that's like, hey, take these 3 colors and make it my own color
Yep.
with like sparkles, right? Okay, so color functions in CSS, you don't need a preprocessor for. Custom functions in CSS, you do need a
Yeah, you
preprocessor.
would still need to use Sass if you're writing your own custom functions
Got it.
that do something that isn't in CSS currently.
Got it. Okay. That makes a lot more sense. Thank you.
The other thing too, th- I guess this is more of a question because it's something I finally realized the other day, and I think I have this rule correct in my head. So I guess I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you this. But the other thing too is that when you have a variable, you can only have one value in that variable when it's passed to a function, right? So you could, for example, I think you can have a variable that would be like if you have a padding, you could have the
Mhm.
variable be like 2 rem space 1 rem or something. And I think that will work. But if you're trying to create like a linear gradient, you couldn't create a variable that's the whole linear gradient arguments and pass it in. I think that that breaks.
Yeah, I don't think that would work. I've never tried that before, but I can't see that working. But I've never tried it. So
Well, I tried
yeah,
it and things went horribly. So
yeah,
if you're
there's
trying
like
to
weird.
pass variables into a function, into a CSS function, you have to have one variable per argument or it won't work.
Yeah, you're talking about putting custom properties in a Sass function. Was that what you were trying to do?
No, like even like
No.
linear gradient. Linear gradient's
Oh,
not that's not
yeah.
Sass, is it?
No,
That's
linear gradient is
yeah.
is native CSS. And there's another gotcha with custom properties that I'm assuming you've probably run into this, but you can't use custom properties as media queries. You can't use a
Yes.
custom property as a media query. And there is a post CSS plugin for custom media, which is a way which is something you can use to put custom properties in media queries, but that's not a default native CSS thing, and it's not yeah, it's not in native CSS. Hopefully, it will be at some point, but right now, there's not a way to do it, and it has to do with the runtime and what the value is at the time that the media query gets run. So it's annoying. It's like I would just
Yeah.
want to use a custom property there, but you can't right now.
So that's a pretty good segue, in fact, to maybe get us back on track because I led us a little astray there with that. That's a very specific question. But um one of the other downsides of CSS, or rather, one of the downsides of Sass, because Sass is great. It's been great for a very long time, and even though pieces of it have been getting into CSS core, so to speak, it still has a lot of value. The downside is it's a dependency, and it has to have a build process, right?
Yep.
So a lot of if we bring it back to Drupal core doesn't use Sass, and part of the reason is for any of the core themes like uh, Olivero or for any of them. And sometimes when you're trying to modify them, it would be nice for it to be in Sass because Sass does have all those conveniences, but Core didn't want to add any of those dependencies to the build process. So
Yep.
how did Drupal solve at least part of the problem with? I think Olivero was the first module to introduce this. It might have been Claro, but how does
Mhm.
Drupal solve this problem at least partially?
Yeah, Yeah, they don't use Sass, but Core and I think Claro uses it too, as you were saying. They use Post CSS, which is a post processor. There still is a build process for it, but it's different than having to set up a whole huge thing to like get it all put together. I know Core has like it's kind of like what you were doing with JavaScript, with you're converting it from ES6 down to previous to ES6 JavaScript. It's a very similar script that you run to convert to run the post CSS processes that Drupal core adds like by default. And I'm trying to remember what post CSS plugins it adds. I should probably explain what post CSS is first before I talk about this. And like I said, it's a post processor. It's pretty much something you run after all of your CSS is compiled if you're doing any kind of compilation. It's things you would do, like one example is converting all your pixels to rems. If you wrote all of your CSS using pixel values, you can run a post CSS script that will go through your entire CSS file and sub out your pixels for rems, so you don't have to do that, and it's done after the fact. The other ones that are in core that might be more relevant would be, I'm trying to remember what else is in core. It's been a while since I've looked. But pretty much when you're writing post CSS, when you're writing CSS in core, you don't write it in a .css file. You write it in a .pcss.css file. And again, that's similar to how JavaScript was written in the back in the days before ES6 was all over the place. Like I think whenever we dropped support for IE11, the ES6 compilation scripts went away too. But you would put all your JavaScript, and I think it was a .es6 file. Is that correct? I'm trying to remember now what you would do with the JavaScript to compile it down. But it's similar with post CSS, where if you're writing CSS files, you'll put everything in a .pcss.css file and then write all your CSS in there. If there's anything that needs to be processed, it'll get processed when you run the build script that's contained within core. Like it's already there within core. If you look at the package.json file, you can see all the scripts you can use to run these. And so you're able to add all sorts of other functionality to your site without having to do the preprocessor. So it's been pretty nice, and it's the way for Core and Claro to get around having to do all the tooling for Sass, which is a little more intensive than just doing the post CSS scripts.
Okay.
It sounds, maybe this is just me being like grumpy old developer guy, but like it sounds like one of those like kind of like crutch things that you build in because you can't change everybody's way of doing things easily, right? So it's like if you have a bunch of people that are like, I like pixels, I can't understand rems, like you build a script to go through afterwards and change all of those, right? Like I mean, I don't know. That maybe that's a great way to do it. I don't have an opinion, but it just kind of sounds like, it sounds like one of those things where it's like, we're going to post process this to clean it up and make it the way that we want to, or that it should be in the first place.
I think I don't do front end development really in core, so I don't really have uh a leg to stand on with this. But I think the only thing that really sticks out to me is that while post processing and post CSS is common, having the whole project be built around that is fairly uncommon. So it just seems a little strange to have like such a it feels like a non-standard way of writing a theme. Like, do you know of any projects that you work on, Aubrey, that only has post CSS processing and not Sass? Like, is
The
that
only
okay?
one hold on one second.
Yeah,
Sorry.
that's very loud. That did come in. So, okay.
I'll just like,
Yeah, that one was very
outside
loud.
here. They leaf blowed my balcony, so I'm happy they did that. But why are they doing it now? They've never done it this time. It's usually like 10 or 11 a.m. So great. All right, looks like they're going away. So hopefully that's better. So
It's
what
fine.
was the question again? Sorry.
Do you have any projects that you work on other than core where post CSS is the only way of processing CSS, or like Sass or less feels like every project uses that?
Yep. Yeah, the only thing I work on that doesn't use Sass is my blog. I only use native Sass and post CSS on there, and not even a lot of post CSS. It is the pixels to rems. I have that one, and the custom media one that's that you where you can use media queries in your or you can use custom properties in your media queries. But yeah,
Okay.
every project I've worked on still uses Sass. I haven't really used any projects that only use native CSS either. So it's pretty much only Drupal when I'm doing core stuff or my personal blog that use
Yeah.
those.
Yeah, it almost feels like a Drupal WTF moment, like, people expect to have some sort of build process. I mean, like I said, I kind of understand the reasons, and I don't do core front end development, so I don't really have a place where I can stand and say that the decision was wrong, or like I'm sure there were good reasons for that decision. But as a non front end developer looking in, it feels a little odd to say the least. But like I said, there I'm Mike Herschel and the team and Christina, they're far better front end developers than me, so I'm sure there's great reasons for it.
Yeah, I don't know the reasoning behind why either. It must be that the tooling would have been I don't know. I don't know if the tooling was just too much for people to set up. Whereas you don't really have to set up anything with post CSS. You pretty much just have to make sure you have yarn running because it's all yarn. It uses yarn and not npm. But that's about it. With Sass, I feel like there's a lot more dependencies you have to include and things like that. But with post CSS, it's a lot less. So it's a little bit better.
So moving out of the code space and into the Drupal space, I'm wondering, are there any like modules that you can recommend that would help people that may not want to jump into their CSS or may not be comfortable doing that? Like, are there any modules that help them better work with colors or better work with CSS in general?
I don't know because I don't use them. I'm really not big into the CSS, like the CSS injector modules and things like that. I've got some opinions about CSS injector. I know you all love it, but I'm not a fan because it opens up a whole can of worms for people to write a lot of CSS that might be inconsistent to any kind of design system conventions and styles that you might want to stick to in your site. So I'm not a huge fan of giving
So
people the keys to the kingdom there, but
So you're okay with me using Asset Injector on my personal website, but you would not suggest that I use it on a client website.
yeah, exactly. Yes, you
Got
can
it.
do what you want with your site. I won't give you a hard time. But
Fair enough.
if you're using a design, if you have a design system and specific colors that like a color palette that your designer or whoever like created, then CSS like asset injector and things like that, I'm not a big fan of because you might it's hard. There's no guardrails in there for writing, like
I,
having things that have insufficient contrast and things like that. So
I want to
yeah, not
be
my
left
favorite.
out of that group. I want to be left out of the group of people that love Asset Injector as well, because I have never used that on a website.
Well,
Now,
so let me just explain the use case, and
oh
then
no,
maybe
I know
there's
the use case. No, no,
there's well,
I
but so
understand the use case.
I'm using Olivero for my theme for my website, and I like getting into that CSS is like just feels daunting. So I'm like, all right, Asset Injector helps me kind of overwrite a couple of things here and there and move a couple of things
Yeah.
around, and it works great, right?
Yeah, no, I think it's fine for that use case. I mean, I think we need some sort of situation like this for Experience Builder.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I don't know how that's gonna mesh with the real world. I'm curious, but yeah, I don't use any of these types of tools,
Hmm.
um, on any sites that I manage. And it's not even so much. I mean, I'm a backend developer, so the front end, I'm not. It's not even so much worried about that. It just feels like a big security
Yeah,
risk,
definitely.
um, like the ability to inject that kind of stuff. So I try to avoid that. But
Yeah,
I can also understand it's very easy to break the front end too, um,
yeah, yeah,
with that stuff.
definitely. I know. Yeah, with that, I have no problem with like having some sort of functionality within like to be able to change the colors and things like that. But if it's already pre-specified colors, which I think that's what Experience Builder is trying to do some of that at first, right? They're kinda having the guardrails initially, like it's only
Yeah.
within single directory components that you're able to change some of the CSS that's in there, which I'm more fine with. But yeah, opening up like, here's a text area where you can put your CSS, that's where I get a little more nervous.
Yep, exactly. Okay, so the last question that we have for you, are there any benefits in that you see with the new way Sass and CSS and are handling color with single directory components and web components?
Yeah, so I've worked a little bit with single directory components, and one thing that I need to figure out how to use with Sass is it would be really, really nice, and I know there's a way to do it, to be able to compile your Sass file within the component itself to create the CSS file right there. It's just the way that you write your compilation has to be able to go through every single one of your component directories to go in there and compile each individual Sass file to be an individual CSS file that only gets included when you're calling that component. That's been a really hard thing to write. I've had a hard time with it with some of the tools we use, like we use DrainPipe at Lullabot, and some of that it's harder to actually get it to rip through every single directory to have the individual CSS files, and that is really nice because then you can have all your individual component CSS and your individual component Sass files separately, so that you're not overloading your entire page with all the CSS for every single component. So that's one good thing that would be useful for single directory components. For web components, like you were saying earlier, custom properties pierce the shadow DOM, so that makes it really nice when you're going in and declaring variables, and you can have them go in there. But besides that, I'm not sure if there's anything else off the top of my head, web component wise, with CSS and color functions. It's mainly that, yeah, you can have the custom properties go inside your shadow DOM elements in your web components and style it the same way as the rest of your site. So that is really nice.
I mean, I would love to collaborate with you guys and figure out the individual JavaScript web component piece, because that's the one piece. Like most of my projects for web components, I just build one giant JavaScript file because it ends up being so much smaller than, like, each individual one has overhead. If you compile them all in one, you save so much
Yeah.
size that it's almost not worth having individual ones. And if you could do partials, like I think Lit lets you do this, I just haven't figured out the
Mhm.
best way to do it. I would love to collaborate with you guys and figure that out because that would solve so many
Yeah.
issues.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, as I mentioned at the top of the show, Aubrey, thank you so much for joining us for the last 4 weeks and for bringing a front end focused topic, because it's been a while since we've had a purely uh, front end front end topic. So it's always nice to chat about new things.
Yeah, it was great. It was great to chat CSS and colors with you. I know the color stuff can be it's hard to show it when you're on a audio podcast where I'm not sharing my screen and presenting, but hopefully there's some stuff in the show notes that give more perspective, give more like images that you can see so that it makes a little more sense.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack and the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing Become a Patron. All right, Aubrey, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, you can find me on Mastodon. That's where I spend most of my time. I am labyrinth.social/starshaped. And if you want to find me on Drupal.org or the Drupal Slack, I am star shaped there.
And John, how about you?
You can find me on all the major social networks at John Picozzi, as well as Drupal.org. And you can find out about EPAM at epam.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
See you guys next
Thanks,
week.
everyone.